Welcome to the future of political consulting. Today's episode looks at one of the biggest forces reshaping our profession, trust. Matt Klink of Klink Campaigns sits down with Aaron Guiterman of Edelman to discuss how rising grievance, declining institutional trust, and emerging technologies are changing the environment in which campaigns operate. Here's their conversation.
All right. Well, Aaron, thanks for joining us. Before we jump into the meat of the questions about the subject, why don't you give a quick thumbnail about what the Edelman Trust Barometer is? Because that's kind of going to set the stage for everything we're going to talk about.
Sure. Thanks, Matt. And I appreciate the AAPC for inviting me here today to talk about the 2026 findings of the Edelman Trust Barometer. Edelman has been studying the dynamics of trust in institutions for the past 26 years, right? So we've been looking at the trust, what drives trusts in the four core institutions worldwide: business, government, NGOs, and the media, and how trust has evolved over time and what those dynamics look like. So we have the advantage of looking at 26 years of longitudinal data from which to look at those drivers of trust. So we should, frame this going into midterm elections on how these drivers of trust can be applied throughout the cycle.
Excellent. All right. Oh, I got to tell you, we had talked before. I remember the first Edelman Trust Barometer, and it's something that I read every year just to kind of give me a gut check on where my political and public affairs clients, what the environment that they're going to compete in. So, one thing that consultants feel every cycle is that the trust environment shifts. We've seen declining confidence in institutions. No one needs to tell anyone on this podcast about skepticism with the media or the growing sense that voters have that the system is just as simply isn't working for them.
Yep.
On the ground, that changes how campaign professionals operate, but it's not always clear, what's just noise from one election cycle and what's actually a deeper structural shift. So let's start there because that's kind of where the trust barometer, focuses. What are the trust trends that you're seeing that aren't cyclical and the ones that are likely to define the next decade?
Sure. Before we get into like the deeper dynamics of that question, I want to lay out some dynamics we're facing as a nation and even worldwide in most developed nations and Western democracy as context. This will help us frame the overall conversation, right? So when we start thinking about where we sit in terms of trust as a country, right, there are four core dynamics that really jump out. Number one, insularity is now a structural element in society, right? We have to navigate this going into the election cycle. It's not partisan. And I'll just give you a couple points of data, right? 70% in the US are hesitant or unwilling to trust someone different from them. It's not a red versus blue issue, right? This is a national condition, right? So when people are unwilling to trust and communicate with one another, that provides some roadblocks for us in communicating and building trust with folks. Number two, trust is local, right? Hard stop. We've gone from trust being a top-down driven dynamic to inside out, right? Number one, my employer is the most trusted entity in the US and globally right now, followed by scientists, teachers, and peers, right? They outperform the major institutions in trust, including media, government, and NGOs, right? Business, in fact, sits as the most trusted entity. And when you drill down in that, my employer and my CEO, because trust works from inside out in those environments, is where it's at, right? And when we think about trust being a driver, it's a behavioral driver. It's not rhetorical, right? People reward institutions that broker trust across differences, and not those that inflame divides. So bringing people together has equity in it, that we're starting to see business can serve as that broker of trust moving forward. And I think the most important element in part of this is economic anxiety is pervasive right now in the United States, right? 75% of respondents believe that the next generation will be worse off economically, right? As compared to previous years when the next generation would be better off. We're looking at more than 3/4 of the country respondents are thinking about the next generation, because we live in an above the line and below the line economy. Those that have benefited from the transition to an innovation economy are the higher income, higher educated individuals, where those that are have a lower income or less educated, work in industrial manufacturing and blue collar jobs, they feel that they're being left behind. And AI is likely going to fuel that and make that wealth divide even wider, right? So when I talk about structural, Matt,
Yeah.
um, it isn't just declining trust, it's defensive, right? It's defensive trust. In the US, about 75% of Americans don't believe the next generation will be better off, right? And that's driven by recession fears. They've returned at all-time highs. 70% say they're hesitant or unwilling to trust someone who views the world differently. And that's a combination of economic anxiety and plus we've moved to this place of insularity.
Yeah.
And that insularity tells us, Matt, it's not a dip, it's a durable shift in how people decide who to trust. So, in politics, we all know it's not just the message, it's the messenger.
Messenger.
So it's
Yeah.
absolutely essential for messengers to be trusted because the message itself isn't necessarily trusted. The first thing that's going to be evaluated is the source of that information.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that that's super important, especially the way that people will run political campaigns. It used to be the old line that everybody hates Congress, but everybody loves their congressman.
Yep.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's necessarily the case anymore. I mean, if the institution of Congress is trusted, incumbents, you know, I know that voters may distrust incumbents, yet they still get reelected with a shocking degree of regularity. Uh, I mean, it just seems like it's a much more chaotic environment for political professionals to structure a narrative, to find relevant spokespeople, to deal in with. I mean, look, I mean, it's not a shocker that the Democrats were hurt by the economy in 2024, and that the Republicans will likely be hurt by the economy in 2026. Um, it just means that there's so much overhang that campaigns now have to deal with
Hmm.
in terms of messaging that it makes it very, very difficult to try to thread that needle. And also knowing that, look, I mean, if people don't trust where they're getting this info, I mean, you have to figure out not only what message you're going to deliver, but what the vertical or who the right message, as you said, the messenger is as important, but also where it comes from is important,
Yeah.
right?
Oh, absolutely. I think I don't know if you saw the Fox News poll that was issued yesterday. It was in the Wall Street Journal. But I mean, even like we said, it's not red and blue issue, it's pervasive, right? Even Republicans have economic anxiety. I think the majority of Republicans, based on that poll, I think it was 54%, feel that the next generation is not going to be better off and that the economy is trending in a downward um, slide rather than an upward slide. So there are some hurdles, right? But there's also some opportunities for both for the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party to kind of address these tensions, alleviate some of these fears, and rebuild trust, not just in the institution of government, but within the states as well, right? When I look at the media environment, and we're talking about this, and you and I have spoken about this at length, but we're living in a world where there's this end of a shared reality, right? In the US, exposure to sources with different political leanings dropped 6 points, right? Year over year. And more than 6 in 10 respondents worry that foreign actors are contaminating our media with mis and disinformation.
Yeah,
Right.
I was going to get to that. Let's talk a little bit about the foreign actors because obviously we know that that was the issue in 2016, but I mean, and again, this is a global study. So, I mean, we have heard about, Russian disinformation campaigns in the Baltics, and in Europe and, the involvement of the, communist China in races.
Yep.
Talk, is it more of a belief or is it a reality?
So I think when you think about, I was asked the other day by a former member of Congress what the new um, vector of warfare is, it's information warfare. We all know that working in politics. But when people believe information systems are manipulated, what breaks first isn't the facts, it's permission,
Yeah.
right? Persuasion cannot begin if legitimacy is denied. And so when we think about that, right, um, there are seams in democracy, particularly in Western democracies, where adversarial nations are using an open pipe to communicate with constituencies to fuel dis and misinformation. So when I break it down, I mean, I look at Syria, China, Russia, North Korea, um, all documented by the previous administration, the current administration, that there are active disinformation engines at work within the United States, right? Engaging constituencies directly. I think the other element to that is when you think about the shards of how information has broken down and the media environment's broken down, right? We live in a time where there is no singular or group of media that's delivering information. Media right now is affirming beliefs, not confirming facts, and the algorithms are continually pushing information that resonates with what you've already consumed, right? So quieting, information that you are not engaging with and amplifying that information that you are engaging with. So, like I said, it's affirming beliefs, not confirming facts, and that's driving a wedge between constituents.
So I mean, look, I think about this from a campaigning perspective. So it really then changes whether you're talking about a turnout election versus a persuasion election.
Yeah.
Because with a turnout election, I know where I can find those people on those media sources, and I can put advertisements there, et cetera. I can use messengers that are going to have instant credibility from a right or a left leaning perspective. But if this is a persuadable election, how do you deal with that reality, knowing that people do that one, that there is this profound distrust, two, that there
Yep.
is clear, you know, the source of their messaging is going to that's not even, they can't even understand what you're trying to say until they say, okay, I believe that what I'm hearing is true. How does that affect how does that affect what campaign professionals have to do?
Well, I think, I'll break it down in a simple soundbite. Trust is a gatekeeper variable right now.
Yeah.
Not only will trust help drive turnout, but will also drive responsivity and adoption of messaging, right? So if we think about in the US, trust across major institutions is largely stagnant, right? And mostly heading in the wrong direction. But when societal events impact trust, people report losing trust in shared institutions while gaining trust in their local circles. We all know politics is inside out. Right. And trust brokering, which is a new concept that Edelman has introduced this year, where you engage not just on shared values, but common interests between people in order to build trust. Right. So all of these dynamics tell us that persuasion now flows through proximity, right, and credibility first. The messenger is evaluated before the message is even considered these days. So that's one thing to think about when you're developing your campaign strategy. The swing vote is changing. It is no longer those that feel disenfranchised or left disenfranchised with the system. It's those who feel left behind. Labor is now a swing vote. Moderate Republicans, moderate Democrats are now swing votes. Issue voters are now becoming likely the key area where it's not just a turnout, Matt. It's more of a now where do my allegiances lie and who am I going to
Yeah.
vote for?
Yeah. Let's the trust barometer talks about, grievance not as anger, but as you just said, a belief that the system is rigged. Geez, I feel like Frank Costanza and Festivus. I've got a lot of grievances with you people. You know, why is that distinction so important though? I mean, that there's a grievance is different than anger.
So in our research, grievance means believing the system serves the few and hurts regular people. But bottom line, among Americans that have an insular mindset, which is 70% of the population, 70% are
Great.
trusting those closest to them in their communities rather than the institutions of business, media, government, and NGOs, right? Grievance is significantly higher by more than 20 points in those populations, right? That's critical because grievance is rooted in perceived unfairness, right? Especially during economic anxiety, um, trade uncertainty and volatility, energy pricing, right? When we think about this, the system is not working for these people. So they've developed this higher sense of grievance that the system doesn't work for me, right? So during these times, it doesn't cool quickly. What's happening is grievance is hardening. It's become insularity, almost like a turtle shell. And I'll say what Richard Edelman said at dinner the other night. We've retracted into the turtle shell, but right now the turtle sits on a 6-lane highway with traffic going in every direction, right? So what we're looking at right now is a really volatile moment for Western democracy, but more importantly, going into midterm elections, right? There are insights here that can be applied to the campaigns to not only drive turnout, but also strengthen the trust in the institution of government, not just at the state and the federal level, but more long term. So I think that there's, part of the of the of the areas the campaigns need to explore is not just, voting for my guy or my woman candidate, but more importantly, how do we lower the temperature, right? How do we design campaigns and messaging and leverage third-party proxy and surrogates in order to bring people together rather than push them further apart.
Well, it's funny, speaking about those surrogates, the challenge of local. I mean, it's no longer the case where you bring a national figure in, like the head of the teachers union or the head of the NRA to
Yeah,
host an event. You would want to bring in the local person to have that conversation.
sure.
Again, because it's personal and everybody can say, "Oh, I know Mary, she's great," which I believe her when she says X. So I mean, again, it's you really have to focus here on a different set of messengers in the campaign, which in theory it could be really, really easy, but
Yep.
for people who look at campaigns from a national perspective and who aren't as familiar with the nuances of districts, I think it's going to create some real problems.
Sure. Listen, with there's distrust in media and distrust in government being at an all-time high, we have to look at those third party and proxy voices that are the most trusted. So right now there's an advantage to my employer, not just business as a whole, but those employers that represent a good portion of the voting constituencies in states, right? If my employer is the only institution that's trusted, right? Followed by scientists and teachers, which remain in there in those trusted voices, it tells us trust is becoming relational and local, right? Influence is shifting from institutions to people with proximity. So if you think about local impact and themes that are expectations of business and local leaders, upskilling, reskilling, are key priorities, right? Individuals don't want to be left behind by the transition to an AI economy. And I can make the argument with reindustrialization, onshoring, and reshoring being bipartisan priorities. We're not just moving into an AI economy, we're moving into a hybrid economy where AI is going to create a whole new class of jobs. What those jobs are TBD, But there is this sense where if we can bring down the economic anxiety, leverage business leaders um, to communicate and showcase and prove the investment they're making in their communities, there's a powerful play there,
Yeah.
particularly in rebuilding trust in government and business. So I'm looking at this inside out, and our data proves it in the fact that my employer, local business leaders, are the most trusted voices, not only because what happens in the walls of a business is kind of and I don't want to use, the term safe space, but it is a place where people with multiple political persuasions go in and out of every day, and the rules are pretty straightforward. Perform, leave your politics at the door, and drive the business forward. So my employer is an area to explore during these campaigns.
That's fascinating. Let me pull out a little bit. Um, uh, when we campaign now, are successful campaigns going to be campaigns that try to correct misinformation, or has this now become the new operating system that confusion and skepticism are just part of the part of the mix that we have to factor in when we bake the cake?
Listen, media is distrusted in 13 of the 28 countries measured globally, right?
Yeah,
And in the US, skepticism is entrenched,
yeah,
right? And so when we look at the baseline, misinformation it's not just about false claims, it's about ambient doubt, right? Corrections don't automatically land because trust wasn't established beforehand.
yeah,
And the media, when we think of the media and the fragmentation of the media market, right? Constituencies are reading and engaging with content in silos. And often there are competing facts. There are, oppositional voices fueled by mis and disinformation. Algorithms are serving biased content and continually driving biased content for engagement. Now, listen, that can be used as an advantage during
yeah.
an election, but mostly it's a disadvantage long term because it further entrenches constituents to oppose, not just oppose the other party, but drive distrust in the institution of media, but also the institution of government. So I think we need to begin thinking long term about the role trust plays in government and what critical role elections play in driving that trust, right? So if trust is given to the individual and we need to reshape what turnout looks like, those that sit in the middle are really important right now. Think about it. 7.5% roughly of the far left and 7.5% of the far right control like 100% of the narrative on social media, right? I mean, Matt, you
True.
and I have spoken about this, right?
Yeah,
And so we can dovetail into that, but that leaves about 85, 90% of folks somewhere in the middle, like, what do I believe? Who
yeah.
do I trust? And who am I going to vote for? So there's a real opportunity there for campaigns to isolate what a swing voter looks like, what issues they're going to respond to, and how that candidate can deliver on the promise of bridging that trust gap and divide.
Yep. Well, I know from look, my longtime involvement with AAPC that there are uh, either many political consultants do corporate public affairs as do political campaigns, or they aspire to do corporate public affairs because the up and down nature of the political campaign world.
Yep.
The simple reality is that the institutions are the ones that hire people like you and people like me. So assuming that polarization isn't going away, and that institutions generally speaking are distrusted, you know, how do we deal, for those of us in the public affairs world, how do we deal with that reality? Because you know those are the people that are going to hire us and the people that are listening to this.
Yeah, bottom line, I think, we as political campaign operatives understand the tensions, frustrations, and optimism that voting blocs need to hear from their represented officials, right? Not only do we know it at a macro level, but the research that's done on voter motivations for elections sets the precedent for most other research for brands
Yeah.
and others. If you look at when big data was leveraged early on in the early 2000s, and really the genesis of mobilizing voters and engaging on mutually shared values, that has been adopted and scaled dramatically by corporate America. So when we think about how voters think, feel, and behave, has very strong parallels to how consumers buy and consider products. But let's go one step further. That research can also be leveraged on how to best build and reestablish an anchor of trust in the institutions that we represent. And folks like us, we represent, well, in previous lives, we represented the institution of government. And so when we begin to think about it, right, we need to break down what those audience frustrations are, where they see opportunities, and then be able to connect those dots. So I think that the collapse of this sense of authenticity is something we need to think about, right? So we do flash polling on trust every year,
Sure.
right? And in our recent flash polling on AI, right, a majority of lower income respondents say people like them are more likely to be left behind by generative AI.
Yeah.
Pair that with like recession anxiety, um, um, and the lack of opportunity that people see moving forward, you get this volatile mix, right,
Yeah.
of distrust. So when you think about economic and technological instability overlapping, trust shifts from evaluating content to evaluating the character of the candidate,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and yeah,
Yeah,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go on.
Well, and the challenge too, though, is those very same voters who fear recession, who fear their economic future, and who believe that artificial intelligence will result in job loss. They're also the ones that probably have the greatest preponderance of the greatest ability to be influenced by AI in political campaigns.
Oh, absolutely. But we also have this K-shaped economy when those who are affluent and educated are more trusting than those who have lower income and lower education, right? One is recovering and more um, resilient to um, economic volatility than the other. And so when we think about how we need to manage these campaigns and our messaging moving forward, optimism is an incredibly powerful tool, right? How do we tap into what optimism should look like in the AI-driven economy when we're trying to revitalize America's industrial base, upskill and reskill workers, but also retrain folks on how to leverage advanced AI and technology in their day-to-day lives. So when I look at it, there's a huge opportunity here for campaigns to reinvigorate the sense of optimism, not just in urban areas, right, on the East Coast and the West Coast, but a lot of the swing states and a lot of the states where we need to win, right, regardless, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Colorado, etc. Those are states that are somewhere in the middle, right? They're
Yeah.
industrial states that need to adapt to an innovation-based economy, right? So how do we bridge that divide where lower income folks that work on assembly lines can feel that they and their families can be competitive today, but also in the future?
I think about this and that, if you're a relative newbie in this political campaign world, you read some case studies in the past and you're like, you know, I got to design that it's all about the persuasive messaging to move voters. But now we're telling them, no, you have to build a trust environment, which is a heck of a lot more than just crafting persuasive messaging. So, what do you think goes into that? I think that that's a fascinating question is how do you build that? I mean, you can start to see the building blocks of things that you highlight in the trust barometer, but it's the
Yeah.
magic is in the mix, and the successful consultants are the ones that have the special ingredient. So, can you elaborate on that a little bit?
I don't know about special ingredient. I think it's a cocktail of
Okay.
ingredient. So nearly half of Americans say distrust across differences is a large or crisis level problem,
Yep.
right? And among those with an insular mindset who only trust people who think, feel like them, trust drops more than 30 points if an institution is led by someone who differs from them in values or worldviews.
Yeah.
So that tells us polarization isn't episodic, it's structural, right? So engagement has to be designed with that in mind. And when we break that down, it's not just shared values, it's long-term, right, mutually shared interests and common beliefs that a lot of Americans share. So I think the majority of Americans are looking for candidates to bring us together rather than wedge us apart. And that's driven by a couple of things. One, economic opportunity. Number two, training, right? Understanding how they can participate and thrive in an innovation-based economy. And then three, trusting that the information that they are receiving is credible and can be useful, and they can depend on that moving forward. So, with this distrust at a crisis level, I think the cycle, there's an opportunity for candidates and campaigns to understand that, yes, there's a far right and then there's a far left narrative, right? That are driving kind of the emotional relevance. But I think that there's a pragmatic middle that people want to get back to,
Yeah.
right? And there is a big opportunity in there for both the Republicans and the Democrats moving forward.
I'm always leery of asking this question, but I'm going to do it anyway. So this is year 26 of
Hmm.
the trust barometer. What's this going to look like in year 31? Let's jump ahead 5 years. Is it going to get worse? Have we not hit quote unquote rock bottom yet? What's it going to, or put it in a more positive way, what's it going to take to get out of the spiral that we're in?
So listen, if 70% of Americans are hesitant to trust across differences, right?
Yeah.
And 75% of voters are pessimistic about the next generation, the next decade isn't going to reward louder persuasion, right? It will reward institutions that reduce economic insecurity, demonstrate fairness, and build local credibility. So durability and trust will outperform sharp messaging long term, right? Now, recognizing that seats, have term limits and so forth,
Yeah.
but longevity is going to be based upon trust, not episodic um, um, dovetailing into current frustrations or media narratives, right? People want long-term trust. People want candidates to represent their long-term interests, not just their short-term ones.
Yeah.
So when we start thinking about the midterms as an inflection point, I honestly believe, and the data underscores this, that there is value in communicating the pragmatic middle, right? And I think a lot of voters are looking for optimism and confidence in candidates who can create opportunity, right? Showcase that they're invested in not just the nation, but in the communities that they serve, and who can tell those often overlooked and undervalued stories of impact that are delivered right there at the local level, right? So your messenger matters as much as your message.
Yeah. Yep. No, that makes a lot of sense. I always say that, you know, I think about it as you have to earn the voters' consent to allow them to govern you, and it's a bill that comes due every day. That you can't just campaign and then go away to Washington D.C. for 2 years and come back and say, "Yeah, I was there doing the people's work." You have to earn it every day, and it almost is campaigns have swung around so that it's not about your ability to function in Washington, D.C. It's your ability to get things done in your district and to be and stay connected. And I
Sure.
think that's just, especially with the distrust that you see going on. I mean, look, that I know from a campaign perspective, I look at, we have better tools to target voters and to do, uh, research on voter thoughts We have, the targeting that we can do is excellent, but frankly, what you're talking about, it's the fundamentals of human behavior. I mean, I
Sure.
don't want to get all philosophical on this conversation, but it's a much deeper than I can squeeze 2% here. It's more, how do you engage and communicate with people in ways that they're going to want to understand and actually hear what you're saying, not just blow you off because you're they don't believe you.
Absolutely. So I'll leave you with this soundbite, right?
Yep.
And this is important. And I look at it through the lens of long-term viability for candidates, but also for business and institutions in strengthening trust. Trust drives growth, but action earns trust. So if we can represent the constituencies that we serve in a manner that creates a sense of long-term optimism and confidence, then we will build trust. But when we think about action, that action is how we behave, how we operate, but more importantly, how we connect at an emotional and a rational level and allow folks to understand that it's okay to be different, while at the same time we share common interests.
Wow, that's pretty profound, the sharing common interests. I mean, look, that for consultants that are scored on a one-loss record,
Mm-hmm.
I think that what you're talking about is long-term success is going to be obviously, yeah. If you win, you're going to get hired. If you lose regularly, you should probably look for a different profession. But I think that what leadership in the political consulting industry and the responsibility in the profession, it's only increasing with the way that the world is heading,
Yep.
and we have a responsibility to run. I mean, look, any idiot can inflame a population, right? But the challenge is,
That's true.
how do you put that cap back on that bottle once you're done? It's like, what is it? We had the destroy the village to save it mentality. I think that we as consultants need to look beyond that to say, what is the style of government or type of government that we want, irrespective of the one loss record. And I think a good consultant will find a way to do both. They'll find a way to win while trying to deal with this new reality. And the old consultant will look at the way, the polarizing past. And I think that hopefully they'll go the way of the dodo bird, but you never know. So, I mean, look, Aaron, thank you for this. I really think that, if you haven't read the Trust Barometer, it's a thoughtful read with, again, 26 years of longitudinal data. It is worth it. It will give you a unique perspective. So I'll give you the last word here. Where do you want to leave us? Where do you want to leave us with the Trust Barometer?
So listen, I really appreciate the time to present and talk about the findings from our 2026 Trust Barometer, Matt. The AAPC's been great partner, and I'm proud to be a member. I think it's really important to think about the responsibility we have as campaign operators moving into the 2026 midterm elections to rebuild trust in institutions, but primarily government.
Amen to that. I think that those are important words that people need to hear. So, all right. Well, thank you. And we are out.
Thanks for listening to The Future of Political Consulting. If you found this conversation valuable, you can continue the discussion through AAPC's programs, events, and member resources throughout the year. Explore our other episodes wherever you get your podcasts and learn more at theaapc.org.